In early March 2012, a 30-minute documentary was uploaded onto YouTube with the goal of bringing the world's attention to a man that was going across East and Central Africa, causing chaos and terror, leaving millions of people traumatized in the process. Millions of people shared one name across the internet: Joseph Kony. But who was Joseph Kony in the first place? And what happened after the camera stopped rolling? This is the story of how Joseph Kony became the world's most wanted warlord. To understand the man that is Kony, we need to take a step back to his roots. Born in 1961 in northern Uganda, he came from really humble beginnings. He was an altar boy in his youth and reportedly enjoyed dancing and participating in village life. However, at the age of 15, he dropped out of school and stopped going to church completely. Kony started taking interest in something else. He started participating in actually spiritual practices, and soon enough, he became recognized in the village as someone who had significant spiritual power, someone who could not just heal, but someone who could talk to the spirits. Now, all the things I've said up to this point probably would have never amounted to anything if it wasn't for what was happening in the country at the time. You see, in 1986, Tito Okello, a president from the Acholi tribe just like Kony, was overthrown by Museveni and his rebel forces. Many reports state that as Museveni moved northwards with his rebel forces, they partook in the looting of livestock, the burning of villages, and many other offenses. And feeling marginalized, many Acholi people started leaving government organizations and joining Acholi resistance movements. At the same time, a woman by the name of Alice Lakwena would form her own movement, the Holy Spirit Movement. Alice would recruit disillusioned soldiers and coerce young men to join her by having them off their own family members, probably as a way to make sure they had nothing to return to. At its peak, the movement would amass a following of over 7,000 people, with the group being fairly successful in their early campaigns. However, their unconventional methods of fighting are probably what led to their defeat. For example, Alice told her followers that the rocks she gave them would turn into grenades when thrown. She also told them that if they drank the water she had blessed, they would become immune to gunfire and that the bullets would turn into water upon coming in contact with them. These unconventional methods of fighting are probably why they saw their defeat when they encountered the more heavily equipped NRA in Jinja. The group suffered catastrophic losses, and faced with heavy casualties, Alice fled into Kenya, leaving her group with no leader. The spot wouldn't stay vacant for long though, because a man, just like Alice, who claimed to be possessed by spirits, came into the spotlight. Joseph Kony. You see, Kony had seen how Alice was able to rally a large number of people behind her simply by forming a group based on spiritual beliefs. So, he decided to follow in her footsteps and make his own group, absorbing remnants from Alice's movement and adding his own ingredient into the mix: violence. And soon enough, a group with the goal of destabilizing Museveni's government and building a system based on the 10 Commandments was formed: the Lord Resistance Army. In the LRA's early days, they were passively supported, or at least they were tolerated by people in the north. Why? Well, remember, the government was led by the same people who had committed atrocities against the people in the north. So, they believed that the LRA was resisting government abuses. The support for the LRA wasn't universal, but they weren't rejected at first. As time went on and the LRA supplies dwindled, Kony came up with the bright idea of raiding the villages of the people that he had claimed to protect, taking anything they could. The people didn't like this, of course, so when the government introduced local defense groups called Arrow groups, the people quickly took initiative in order to protect their villages. Kony did not take this well though. He saw it as people choosing the government over him. He saw it as a betrayal, so he decided to unleash his wrath on them. Kony massacred villages using extreme violence and brutal techniques of torture, punishing anyone he thought was working with the government. He mutilated people's ears, noses, lips, hands, anything he could get his hands on. You could say a lot of things about Kony at this point, but one thing was clear: he had turned on the very people he promised to protect. With dwindling support, Voluntary recruitment dried up, so Kony had to find another way to get soldiers. Kony resorted to abductions. He would abduct children in large numbers, brainwash them, then force them into the LRA's ranks. The boys would become child soldiers, and the girls would be wives for his commanders. One famous case came from Aboke in 1996. In the dead of night, 300 LRA rebels raided a girls' high school and abducted 139 of them. The headmistress immediately chased after them to negotiate their release, but unfortunately only 109 of them were ever released, and the other 30 were taken into camps to become wives for Kony's commanders. Kony used abductions to grow the LRA, and by the early 2000s they were operating at a much larger scale. They moved into Sudan because the Sudanese government was supplying them with weapons and safe bases. You might be asking yourself, why would the Sudanese government support rebels from Uganda? Well, Uganda and Sudan had this thing going on at the time where Uganda was supporting Sudanese rebels, so the Sudanese government thought this would be a good way to retaliate. The LRA only continued to raid villages in southern Sudan, but the government didn't care because the people in the south were the enemy anyway. The Ugandan government would launch an operation in 2002, striking LRA bases in South Sudan. This, however, had unintended outcomes, with many LRA fighters fleeing back into the country and continuing their campaign of terror. The following years are what are considered to be the worst years to live in close proximity to the LRA. In 2003, the war reached its terrifying peak. By this point, the LRA was not fighting for the Acholi people at all. They were surviving by the fear they inflicted on the people by raiding their villages, burning their homes, and by abducting their children. Between 2003 and 2005, an estimated 20,000 children were abducted by the LRA. It got so bad that parents would send their children every evening to nearby churches, hospitals, any establishment, in fear that Kony and his men would come in the dead of night and abduct their children. As many as 40,000 children would make this journey every single night in fear of abduction. This was routine everyday life for people in the north. The north had changed. 2 million people had been displaced into overcrowded camps seeking protection from Joseph Kony. Entire communities lived in fear, unsure whether the next night would be their last. By 2005, Kony's name was not known only by local governments, it was known by international governments and organizations. Kony had multiple arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. Peace talks were finally held between 2006 and 2008. There was finally hope that the conflict could end. But as time went on, one thing became apparent to Kony. Peace meant surrender, and surrender meant spending the rest of his life behind bars. So, he refused to sign the peace agreement. All negotiations collapsed, but local governments weren't just gonna give up on Kony just like that. They launched a massive attack on Kony in an attempt to capture him. Even though Kony wasn't the smartest person around, he sure was good at one thing: vanishing into the jungle. And just like that, Kony had evaded capture, scattering his group into 4 different countries: Uganda, Southern Sudan, DRC, and Central African Republic. The LRA was now in a weakened state, surviving as a shell of its former self. They had lost all political legitimacy, but this wouldn't be the last time people would hear about them, because in 2012, a 30-minute documentary was uploaded onto YouTube by Invisible Children, making Kony known worldwide. Kony became one of the most recognized war criminals in the world. While it was praised for raising awareness, it got criticized for oversimplifying the conflict and heavily focusing on military solutions. That didn't matter though, because governments were pressured to launch a manhunt for Kony and the LRA. But Kony being Kony, he evaded capture every single time. This doesn't mean that the LRA continued to get stronger though. They actually got weaker. Many of their commanders surrendered or were captured. Abductees escaped. The group shrank from thousands of members to only a couple hundred. The LRA had all but disappeared. The group that had terrorized millions of people was now hiding deep within the continent's jungles. But the story doesn't end there. Joseph Kony is still out there, running free, while the legacy of his actions haunts survivors to this day.